New Zealand's west coast looks like a painting until you step into it. The sea pushes in with steady force. The cliffs stand in layers that catch the salt and the mist. The bush folds in tight, then opens without warning into pockets of pasture, where cattle graze and birds ride the updrafts. Roads begin as smooth ribbons, then turn to gravel, then turn to tracks that know more about boots and quad bikes than they do about cars. This is where our story sits. It starts in the small settlement of Maricopa and spreads through the western Waikato bush. It follows a father named Tom Phillips and his 3 children. It follows police, volunteers and communities that kept looking and kept hoping. It ends on a cold, dark stretch of road near Piopio. If you only remember a few headlines, you remember that Tom Phillips took his children into the bush and stayed out of sight for a very long time. You remember that people saw things at the edges of their days. A figure in farm gear refueling late at night. A quad bike parked where no one expected a quad bike to be. A child's voice that carried on the wind when it should have been impossible. You remember that police searched and searched. You remember that in time there were heavier allegations that raised the stakes. You remember that in 2025, all of it collided on one night. Let us begin at the first turning. In late September 2021, Tom Phillips and his children were reported missing. The family ute showed up on Curitier Beach, stranded below the tide line. The details were odd enough to spark a major response. Land crews, dog teams, aircraft, locals who knew the coast well walked dunes and gullies and rocky shelves that turn slippery when the spray comes in. For days, the search took on a rhythm of hope in the morning and worry by night. Then came the relief that cut through the fog. The family reappeared alive. There were charges, there was a court date, and it looked as if the story might move back into ordinary daylight. It did not. In December 2021, the family vanished again. This disappearance did not relax into a safe return. Weeks passed. A missed court appearance meant a warrant. The working theory formed that Tom and the children were living somewhere in the western Waikato. That region is a maze of ridges and streams, with pockets of farmland stitched between blocks of dense canopy. If you know those tracks and you move at first and last light, you can be hard to find. If you are quiet, and if you never leave your vehicle where a stranger can notice it, you can pass within 100 meters of a homestead and no one will ever know. From that point on, the story took on a long, low hum. Tips came in. Some were well meant and wrong, some were close, and by the time anyone arrived, the sign had gone cold. One day, someone saw a man in a rural stall who had the same build and the same way of moving. Another day, a young farmhand thought he saw children crossing a fence line where there was no reason for children to be. Every tip took people away from other work. Every search had to contend with rain that made tracks into mirrors, or wind that carried scent in crazy directions, or nights where fog turned headlamps into white walls that blocked their own light. People outside the region asked why it took so long to find anyone. People in the region did not ask that question as often. They know that country. What looks close on a map can be an hour on foot, then a climb, then a creek crossing that floods with a single storm. A quad bike can get you far, but it cannot get you everywhere, and the deeper you go, the easier it becomes to hide a camp in a fold of land that never sees a truck. Add the fact that this was not a simple rescue. This was a long attempt to locate 3 children safely without forcing a desperate move. That caution shaped every decision. As months turned to a year, the public conversation split in two. On one side were people who focused on the children. They asked how the children were coping. They asked about school, health, routine, safety. On the other side were people who focused on the hunt itself. They asked where supplies came from, whether anyone was helping, how often the camp moved, and how you lived through a winter under tarps without a wall to lean against. Both sides were talking about the same story, yet they were standing in different places while they talked. One group stood in a classroom in their minds and imagined empty desks. The other group stood on a ridge in the rain and imagined a small fire that must be protected from the wind with a body that is already cold. In 2023, the tone shifted. Police alleged that Tom Phillips had taken part in an aggravated robbery in Te Quiti and that there was a firearm in the picture. Allegations are not verdicts, yet they changed the calculations that officers must make. They changed the public mood too. A man living off the grid with his children is one set of risks. A man linked to a serious crime with a gun involved is another set of risks altogether. Through all of this, the children remained under the protection of privacy rules that limited what could be reported. Those rules exist for good reasons. They stop vulnerable people from being turned into characters in other people's stories. I had this idea of they also keep a lid on rumour, though in a case that ran this long, social media often outpaced restraint. By mid-2024, police offered a reward for information that would lead to the children being found safely. $80,000 is a signal, and it did spark a rush of calls. A few tips had the grain of truth in them. Others were guesses with confidence on top. Then the noise settled again, and the long quiet returned. Later that year, a sighting near Maricopa suggested that the group was still close to the coast and still moving in the same slice of country. If you looked at a map, the area did not seem large. If you stood inside the map, it was huge. Through this period, towns connected to the case carried on as best they could. Maricopa, with its coastal rhythm, TQT, with its rail lines and Main Street storefronts that know the sound of work boots, Keopio with its cafes and farm supply stores, and a sense of place that makes small towns feel like family. People went to school, dropped off and picked up groceries and stood in the wind at sports fields. Under the surface, the case was always there. In conversations between friends, it was a question with no clean answer. Should people help police as hard as they can, even if it meant telling on someone they once called mate? Should people mind their own business, even if that meant children might spend another winter in the bush? No one likes those choices. Some tried not to choose at all. By 2025, the manhunt had a shape that everyone recognized, even if they did not like it. You could feel it in the way people looked twice at a quad bike heading into a block of bush just before dusk. You could feel it when headlights approached on quiet roads after midnight, and the car passing slowed for a beat to see who you were. Officers patrolled in patterns that made sense to them. Locals adjusted their habits without saying it out loud. Journalists drove the same circus and tried to gather facts in a landscape that does not care for deadlines. Then came a night that changed the tenor of everything. In the early hours, an alarm went off at a rural supply store in Keopio. Lights clicked on around town. Phones buzzed on bedside tables. In small places, an alarm does not ring into a vacuum. It rings into a community that knows who might answer and who might be passing through. Reports began to thread into the police net. 2 people on a quad bike, farm clothing, headlamps. Officers moved fast because in rural areas, distance is not just a number on a sign. Distance eats time. Road spikes went down on a route that someone guessed would be used. The guess was right. Of the quad hit the spikes, metal on tar, then a heavy stop. Then the still tense silence that comes after a vehicle is no longer a vehicle. What happened next was short enough to fit inside a few sentences and heavy enough to fill a lifetime. An officer approached. Shots were fired from a rifle. The officer went down, critically injured. Another officer returned fire. Tom Phillips was hit and died at the scene. There were no scriptwriters present, no pauses for reflection. There was training, there was fear, and there was the kind of chaos that turns seconds into long stretches of thought, where you notice every detail and remember none of it clearly later. The injured officer was rushed toward care. The scene was locked down. The story that had stretched for years snapped to a point. Even with that finality, the most important question remained. Where were the children? As dawn came on and the fog thinned, searches unfolded on foot and from the air. One child was found in the aftermath of the roadside confrontation. The other 2 were located later at a campsite tucked away from view. They were brought into safety and placed in the care of the Ministry for Children. That was the goal from the first day of the first search. Bring them in alive, bring them in gently, bring them to warmth and assessment and steady hands. In the days that followed, the public started to see images and descriptions of the camps that had kept the family going. There were tarps strung to break the wind. There were gas bottles and cookers. There were supplies that do not fall from trees. People who lived in the bush could read the camps like a book. They could see how long the stove had been used. They could see repairs on shelter edges where the wind had chewed the first fix loose. They could see the discipline it takes to pack out rubbish or to bury what you cannot carry so that it does not draw animals or curious eyes. They could see hands at work over seasons. They could also see the cost of such living, most of it carried by children who did not choose it. That cost deserves a clear look. Off-grid life carries a certain romance when it is painted in broad strokes. You picture a river bath in midsummer, not the chill of the water in late autumn when the wind cuts. You picture a fire under clear stars, not the smoke that sticks to damp clothes for days. You picture silence that feels like peace, not the silence that sits heavy when someone is sick and the nearest clinic is hours away, on paths and roads that cannot afford any mistake. Adults can sign up for hardship in service of a principle. Children should not be asked to bear that same weight for that same length of time. That is not a judgment handed down from a mountain. It is a simple statement about what a healthy childhood usually needs. Warmth, predictable meals, school days that begin and end in familiar ways, adults who do not have to look over their shoulders while they help with homework. While investigators moved through campsites and packaged evidence and followed threads that might explain how the family stayed supplied, the wider public tried to process a set of conflicting feelings. There was the shock of the roadside shooting and the officer's injuries. There was grief for a father who died, a grief that did not sweep away the harm of his choices, yet still held a real sadness. There was relief that the children were alive and safe. There was anger too, and frustration, and the tired ache that comes when a long effort ends in a way that everyone wishes had not happened. People placed flowers. People argued online. People cooked dinner, tucked their own children into bed, and stared at the ceiling thinking about a cold camp somewhere out there that would now stay empty. In small communities, aftermath is not a news cycle. It is the weeks after the cameras leave. It is the way an officer's partner stands in a grocery aisle and cannot remember why they came down that road. It is the way a farmer repairs a gate and pauses halfway through because the memory arrived out of order. It is the way a school counsellor sits with a child who has questions that are much bigger than the child is. It is meals dropped at a door and drives offered in silence at the right time. It is also the way gossip finds its level. Wisdom sits close by. People who know how to hold their tongue do good work during these periods. They say less, they listen more, they leave space for the families most involved to begin to breathe again. When authorities spoke about the case, they kept returning to a few points. Anyone who helped Tom Phillips while he was on the run would be looked at carefully. The children's privacy would be protected. The officer's recovery would be measured in months, not days. For the rest of us, the lessons were not complicated, yet they were not easy. The bush is still the bush. It can hide you if you ask it to. It can chew you up if you ask too much for too long. Love is not always the same thing as good judgment. Determination can be a virtue and a trap. Communities can be both generous and stubborn in the same hour, and that mix can either save a life or prolong a situation that should have ended sooner. If you watch this from outside New Zealand, the scale may be hard to grasp. This is a small country in population. News ripples fast. Names land on breakfast tables. A case like this becomes a shared story quickly. It carries older themes too. Independence, self-reliance, a respect for the land that sometimes slides into the idea that you can win any argument with a long walk and a fire. Those themes are not bad. They built useful things. They also need a frame. The frame is simple, children first. The law is not an enemy. The bush is beautiful, and it does not owe any of us a living. It is worth taking a slow look at the police side because it explains some of the pacing. Searching for a willing adult is one thing. Searching for 3 children who are with that adult changes everything. The urgency to find them sits at the top of the list. Yet the urgency cannot justify tactics that increase the risk of someone being hurt. That is why some days looked quiet from the outside. That is why progress came in waves. Leads had to be weighed not only for accuracy but for safety. You do not charge into a camp when there are children inside, unless you have no other choice. You do not push vehicles into terrain where the only retreat is a single slippery track that can be blocked by one tree. The calculations are patient because the goal is not a headline. The goal is safe hands on small shoulders. We should also talk for a moment about how easily rumour grows in the vacuum created by privacy rules. These rules are not born from a desire to hide the truth. They are born from a desire to protect the vulnerable and prevent trials in the court of public opinion from overwhelming trials in actual courts. When rumour anchors itself, it is usually because it provides a feeling of certainty that people crave when the facts are slow. The answer to rumour is not to demand facts that cannot be shared. The answer is to practice steadiness. Wait, check. Do not treat a confident tone as a source. Remember that patience is not the same as apathy. What remains now is a path forward for the children and a set of reflections for everyone else. The children will be held by systems that are designed to be careful. The adults around them will work to rebuild routine, to assess health and education needs, to reconnected family ties that can be reconnected safely, and to provide quiet where quiet has been rare. That work is not cinematic. It is steady and kind and sometimes frustrating. It depends on professionals who can absorb difficult stories without letting those stories leak into their own lives. It depends on communities that can keep their focus on the welfare of the children rather than on the drama of the case that shaped the last few years. For the rest of us, the reflections are straightforward. There is a limit to what a parent should ask a child to endure in the name of any principle. There is a limit to how far any of us should push the idea of self-reliance before it begins to harm the people we say we love. There is a lesson about listening to local knowledge when searches extend beyond a day. There is a lesson about humility too. Even with technology, even with effort, human beings can still miss one another by a few minutes, and a bend in the track. The bush will keep its secrets for as long as it wants to. Picture that final road for a moment, not to relive the worst of it, but to understand the weight that comes from a long chase ending in a few terrible seconds. A stretch of rural tar, chewed at the edges by weather and years. A fence line that hums in the wind. A ditch that carries water when the rain comes heavy. In the dark before dawn, the air is cold in a way that makes your breath feel loud. Officers make decisions that cannot be unmixed later. A life ends. Another life hangs in the balance. A set of young lives changes direction in a single morning. The rest of the country wakes and learns that the chapter closed while they slept. If there is a way to hold this story, it is to hold several truths at once. A father's love can be real, and his choices can still be wrong. A police officer can be brave and still be a person who deserves time and space to heal without being made a symbol. A community can be proud of its independence and still find its best self in cooperation. The bush can be a refuge and still be a hard place for children. None of these truths cancel the others. They ask to be carried together. So let's close where we began, on the west coast, where the sea keeps its own time and the cliffs keep their own counsel. Somewhere out there a camp is empty. The tarps are down. The firing is cold and scattered. The track that led to it is already softening under fern fronds and leaf litter. The land will fold around that space and turn it into another small hollow that asks nothing of anyone. What matters now is elsewhere. It is in warm rooms where a kettle clicks off. It is in clinics where a nurse checks a dressing and makes a small joke that lands. It is in classrooms where a teacher explains a new chapter in a way that brings confidence back to a young face. It is in kitchens where dinner smells like safety. It is in the everyday, which is where children belong. Thank you for listening. If this story left you with heavy feelings, sit with them a moment. Think of the officer who is recovering. Think of the families who are adjusting to a future that looks different than it did a month ago. Most of all, think of the children and the people now focused on helping them find steady ground. May their next seasons be measured in school terms and birthdays and ordinary weekends. May the loudest sounds in their lives be laughter and cheers from a sideline. May the land that hid them for so long now simply be a backdrop to safer days.